So I thought I'd do a quick little video here on flaps, essentially what flaps do, how they behave in game. Some people have had some issues in the challenge with that, so I thought I'd kind of go over it. So let's go back to my trainer here. Um, Trainer has flaps right here. And so one of the things you want to notice, let's bring it back to the workbench really quick. And so let's look at the center of gravity. So need to understand some things about how flaps work in real life and how they work in game, and they're actually not too far off. So if we look at our center of gravity here, let's make a pink block. So my pink block is right here. So that is my center of gravity, is right there. And so if we look at my wing, it's not perfect, but if we were to draw like a line from about there to here, measure it, that's 13 blocks, so we're talking probably about 7. So somewhere in this neighborhood here would be our center of lift. We're not gonna talk about body lift. The body creates some little bit of lift, but that's about centralized where my center of lift is. But you also need to realize that my tail plane is also giving me, my horizontal tail plane is also giving me some lift. So the likelihood is that our lift gets dragged back maybe a block or two. So if you set your aircraft up correctly, you kind of realize that you have a horizontal tail plane, you have your main wing here, and with that pulling the center of lift back, as you notice this wing has much larger wing area than the horizontal tail plane, we're probably getting to pull back somewhere within a block or two of the center of gravity. So here's our CG, there's probably our center of lift. Now, when we talk about our flaps, if we look at our flap right here, this is our flap. So our flap right here is about 2 blocks wide, maybe 3. I don't know how the game exactly calculates it, but let's say that at most it's about that 3 wide right there. All right, so let's say that the center of lift is in the middle of that. So let's say that's part of our center of lift. So if we consider the tail plane, and that drags our center of lift back to here, and then we consider this surface here, which actually probably produces quite a bit of lift because it's actually a control surface. We're probably pulling our center of lift back at least a block or two. So let's say that this is our new center of lift. So right here, and we'll color this something different here. Let's just color this green. So this is our center of lift. So center of gravity, center of lift. So when we put the flaps down, it's going to move our center of lift aftward. Well, if our center of lift is aft of our center of gravity, it's going to cause a pitching moment. So it's going to cause this part to come up, this part to come down, and it's going to pitch our nose down. Now, you'll notice this in real aircraft. This is what happens when you add the flaps. You're generally adding some lift just aft of your center of gravity. That helps you bring your nose down when you're landing. Flaps do multiple things. They change the camber of the wing. So the camber is the bend of the wing. You think a flap goes down, it adds more curve on the inside of the wing. That increases lift. Depending on the type of flaps, like these types of flaps, all they're adding is camber. They're not adding any length of wing. Some flaps will slide back, and they'll also add length of wing. So you get camber, you get length of wing. And so that's going to be how the flaps add lift. Flaps are also designed to add drag. So for example, especially in jets, or aircraft, let's say that have a nice swept wing, you're changing the camber, you're giving the wing more bend, you're also often giving it more width or more length to give it more surface area for more lift as well. But it's also adding more drag, and that allows you to keep your engine at a higher power setting, which is keeping your engine essentially, if it's a turbine, you have to worry about spool up time. I won't go into spool up time. Spool up time is pretty quick now for modern turbines. Old turbines had a long spool up time, and so it helped you keep your either your reciprocating engine or your turbine spooled up so that it's spinning at a higher RPM so that you can more easily make changes. And so understanding that flaps are both adding drag and flaps are also adding lift, you need to understand how this is gonna what this is gonna cause your airplane to do. So because the center of lift with the flaps down is aft of the center of gravity, we'll notice a lifting moment that picks up here. Well, because this is aft of the center of gravity, that's also going to tend to cause it to push forward. So it's going to lift us up and forward. So we'll do a quick test flight, and we'll notice that when I put in the flaps, If we watch my altimeter, if I don't do anything, let's say I keep my pitch the same, it's going to lift me up. It's going to balloon. We're getting that extra lift from the flaps. If I don't hold my pitch the same, what's going to happen is cause my nose to pitch down because the center of lift is behind the center of gravity. It's also going to give me some drag, so I have to anticipate that I'm going to have to add some power to counteract that drag. So we need to understand all these components in order to make this work. So let's go do a little flight. I changed the way the nose wheel steers, so I haven't tested it yet. So if I have a little wobbly on takeoff, that's because I changed something and have yet to test it. All right, so let's go ahead and start going out there. All right, so did I release the brake? Where's brake, brake, brake? Release parking brake. All right, so the other thing we want to do is let's put in a little flap. Now, different aircraft use different flaps for takeoff. Some use none, some use a little bit, some, depending on different things. You might, in a normal takeoff, you might use 0 degrees of flaps. If you're taking off for a soft field or a short field takeoff, you might use some flaps. In this aircraft, I tend to, if I can remember where my flap control is right there, I tend to take off with 1 notch of flaps, just a little bit of flaps. Now, what we have to understand is because that flap is just aft of the center of gravity on this particular aircraft, it's going to make it harder to lift the nose up. And so if you're having problems lifting your nose up, you may want to try a flaps up takeoff or even a negative flap takeoff. There are planes that have negative flap settings. And so some of the stall aircraft, short takeoff and landing aircraft, will actually do a slight negative flap up, but that's usually for cruise because the wing has so much lift and it causes a lot of drag, induced drag because of the camber of the wing, that they'll actually have a negative flap setting which will reduce drag for when they're cruising. So on this plane, I'm going to go ahead and do a flaps first notch. That's in degrees, so that's about 7 degrees. In the airlines, in the Embraer 145, you used to take off with 9 degrees of flaps. So you notice 7 is pretty minor there. All right, so we'll go ahead and take off with 7. So let's go ahead. Parking brake is released. All right, we're good to go. So we're going to go full throttle here. All right, and I have the yaw going through the gyro for the steering wheel. Now, notice I didn't hit my tail either. We'll talk about that. Some people have been having some tail strike issues. All right, so now let's talk about the flaps here. So we got traffic looking about 11 o'clock, transition to 10 o'clock high. All right, so let's level off here. Let's level off about 1,000 just to make it easy here. So I have 1 notch of flaps in. Let's take the flaps out. So we're going to go up on flaps. I'm going to try to keep some altitude here. Maybe get my horizon set. I'm not going to change power. We'll level off here. So we're about level here. See about 720, 721. I'm keeping it within 10 feet. Now I'm going to just dump flaps in. I'm not touching anything but the flaps controller. Watch my altitude. Climb, climb. See it? We're gaining a ton of lift, but notice my pitch didn't pitch up. And now look at it. My pitch is actually pitching down. We are gaining lift with the nose down. Now, there's actually a video on YouTube I just saw that posted today, the bomber that always pointed down in level flight, and that's a clear indication that your center of lift is aft of your center of gravity. Different planes have different approach attitudes. And the jets I used to fly, they tend to, if you're used to Cessnas, flying that jet would seem like your nose is pointed way too low. That's because of the angle of the nacelles of the engine, the type of the wing, how much flap you have in there. You needed actually some nose down pitch to kind of not gain altitude. So let's go ahead and try to maintain our altitude here. So I'm going to try to keep this right in the money. Look at my pitch indicator right here. Notice I am about negative 11 degrees, and I'm just gently descending. Let me try to keep us there. But look, about 10 degrees, I'm still holding my altitude. That's because of my flaps are aft of my center of gravity. There's nothing wrong with that. You just need to understand that a nose down attitude is what is going to happen with those flaps. Now, another thing to understand, your flaps are adding drag in game, and they're adding drag in real life. Now, you notice how minor my nose pitch is, right? It's not that bad. I'm pitching down about 10 degrees. Now, if my flaps were further aft, my nose would be like this. Well, guess what? You'd have to pitch with elevator too. So not only do you have the drag of the flaps, but you'd be having the drag of the elevator. So you want to make sure those flaps are not too far from your center of gravity. You know, we would have less of a pitching moment if I bet you if we moved those flaps one block further forward. But I actually kind of want a little bit of a nose down pitching moment. I'm happy with that. It's functioning, working fine for me. But you need to kind of keep that in mind. The other thing I'd recommend is if you're struggling to take your aircraft off the ground, and let's say you're steering a lot, the wheel in the game is going to cause some drag. I recommend pumping the yaw command or whatever you're using to steer your vehicle through the gyro. That will cause it so that it's smoother when you're trying to steer down the runway. And if it's smoother when you're trying to steer down the runway, it is less likely that that wheel is going to be causing a ton of drag, and it's going to be easier for you to land. So I'm watching my speed. I'm getting a little slow. I don't want to get slower than about 65 at the slowest. I tend to keep it a little fast in the 70s. But this plane is feeling very realistic to me. It's feeling like it has a good center of gravity and setting of flaps. Got a little sink right there. I'm starting to pitch my nose back up, and I'm adding power because I know that as I pitch my nose up, I need to add power. Now, all right, so let's go ahead and we'll land here. And let's talk tail strike here. So I'm going to try to get us turned around here. Let me get the flaps, put the flaps all the way up. So if you're having tail strike issues where your tail is hitting the runway, that's also an indication that your flaps, you know, the flaps potentially could be too far aft. Hold on, I'm having some steering issues here. Let me brake. Let me put some brake on here. Okay. There we go. All right, I'm going to just recall it because I changed the way my wheel works, so I have a little issue there. But so let's go ahead and take off with flaps set to 0. All right. So we'll watch our tail strike on this one. We'll see how close our tail gets. I'll recall the vehicle. We'll take it off again, and we'll see how flap changes interfere with that. So we're going to start with 0 flaps. Okay. So all the way up. Flaps 0. All right. Look at the flaps. Flaps are 0. Let's go ahead and taxi out there. All right, so what I'm essentially saying is if your flaps were further aft, if they were even more aft, closer to the tail, essentially making your center of lift further back from your center of gravity, what it's going to do is it's going to try to help keep your nose down. It's kind of like your elevators were doing this, right? Your elevators, that would be pushing your nose down. You want to do this to pick your nose up. Well, if your flaps are too far aft of your center of gravity, it's going to make it very hard for you to pick that nose up. And you're going to be fighting it the whole time, and eventually when you get enough airflow, you're going to hit the tail. Now, I'm not overly concerned with tail strikes. They'll often put a little piece of metal on the tails of aircraft to prevent tail strikes. I'm going to probably limit this wheel to 45 degrees. All right, so let's go ahead. We're taking off with a flap 0 takeoff. I'm going to do essentially a short field takeoff where I just put in some pitch, and whenever it wants to take off, it takes off. Yeah, let's see if it does it. All right, so I have to do that again. I think I had the parking brake on. So let's try it one more time. It's hard for me when I'm not in the cockpit. I do all my flying from the cockpit, so. Did not know what my parking brake was doing. All right, parking brake should be off now. I'm going to go to the end of the runway just to make sure that I can complete the test and not screw it up. Oh, hitting the friggin' wall. All right, let's taxi here. I need to limit my nose wheel. I made some changes to my nose wheel, and now I need to, forgot to limit it, so I need to limit it to about 45 degrees. All right, so I'm going to try to see what my speed is here from the outside. So we're going to do, again, a flaps 0 takeoff. Now, one thing you could do is, again, I'm happy to fly whatever procedures you say. You know, if they're really, like, you know, challenging procedures that a student pilot wouldn't like, you might, you know, get dinked a little point on that. But you could do negative pitch in your flaps if need be. So here we go. I'm going to do minor steering. Minor steering is going to cause less drag on the wheels. I'm going to pitch. Gently pitch. Notice I lift off before my angle of attack caused me to lift off before my tail ever got close to the ground. Okay, that's with flap 0 takeoff. So let's recall it. So should be able to take off without. So let's dump in a bunch of flap here, and let's try to keep it scientific. We'll keep it the same here. Yep. So try to keep it scientific and the same here. Go to the same spot on the runway. The difference here is I'm going to put in about half flaps. So that right there is about half flaps. We have 45 degrees of flaps total. So about there is probably half flaps. So 20-something degrees of flaps are in there. And it's easy to do the degrees because you know that max deflection on this is half. Half is 45 degrees. That would be a factor. So a full deflection is 1. So if you do 1 times 45 and you read that out in your gauge, it will give you the degrees of your flaps. So running about 20-something degrees, 23 degrees of flaps about. Now, generally, you won't do this much flap on takeoff. I think Piper Warrior standard procedure with 1 notch flaps. I think that's somewhere in the neighborhood of, it's pretty low. I think it's 9, 10 degrees, something like that, if memory serves from 20 years ago. Embraer 145 was 9 degrees of flaps for takeoff. I think a lot of Cessnas, unless you're doing a shorter soft field, you're doing 0 degrees. So here's 23 degrees. So I'm going to do it the same. Now my center of lift is going to be trying to push my nose down. So this is going to be a little bit more challenging for me to get this nose up. Now I'm not doing anything with the elevators. That adds drag. See my tail coming up? That's because the flaps are pushing it. Look at that. No problem. All right. So let's keep testing it. So these are the kind of tests that are helpful. So we're taking off in plenty of runway. Let's go ahead and so this is giving us a lot more lift. You notice how it was picking up the tail first, right? The main wheels were actually coming off first. Now in real life, you could wheelbarrow like that. It's probably unlikely just because of the mass and whatnot. But so let's go ahead and I'm going to go full flaps. Here's 45 degrees of flaps here. So let's go all the way to 45. Okay. So we have 45 degrees of flaps. We have full flaps in. The likelihood of you ever trying to take off like this would be very slim. You're going to be adding a lot of drag. You're going to be adding a lot of lift after the center of gravity. And that's going to mean you're going to need a lot of elevator to get your nose up. Well, that's adding even more drag. So I'm going to wait till the wings start taking some lift. There they are. Start pitching my tail down. I'm holding my tail down. Nothing. Nothing. Can't do it. Can't do it. Can't do it. Can't do it. All right, barely in the air now. And the reason is, look at my flaps. My flaps are coming down at 100%, causing lots of drag. I'm right on the edge of a stall right now. Look at my elevators. My elevators are all the way up, trying to pitch my nose up. So see that? That's lots of drag. That's lots of drag. All right. So if you're really struggling, you could try something like a little bit of a negative flap figure for takeoff. So let's try something really quick. So let's do 10% negative flaps. So let's do a constant number. Okay, we'll do a constant number right here. And let's just do, I don't know, negative 0.1. So that's some negative flap. So that's going to lose lift. We're going to lose lift. But that might, if we're struggling to get our nose off the ground, if your flaps are too far back, they're causing too much lift behind the center of gravity, that's going to actually cause your tail to come down more easily. So you could try something like this. You can make the 0 position a negative number to start with on your flaps. Generally, you don't want to have to do that, but if we look at our flaps here, let's look at them. So we're at negative, so we're at 10% negative flap. So what's that, 4 degrees of flaps, 4.5 degrees of flaps. We're going to leave our flaps with that. Well, we can't control it from there anymore. All right, so we'll take off halfway down the runway again, and we'll see if this, you notice that the tail was lifting first. Again, the flaps are aft of center of gravity. Let's see if this helps. Now, we're going to lose lift on the wing because that's giving us negative lift, essentially. But it's going to help our tail come down and help us pitch. So it might work. It might work on your build. You might decide, you know what, I'll add a little hair of negative flap to start with. And it always helps if I shut the parking brake off. All right, I'm going to tag and brake on the way out here. Not very scientific right now. Let's test it. Full throttle. So let's see. Tail starting to get some lift. No problem with that. Now that was a little bit closer on the tail, but it wasn't bad. So that's with negative 10 degrees flaps. Let's bring it back. We'll do another test. Let's go in here. Let's do something, oh, I don't know. Let's do negative 0.3. So that is 12, 13 and change degrees flaps, something like that. $13.5 degrees of flap, something like that. All right, so let's taxi out on this one. Let's watch our tail. Let's watch how it behaves. Notice the flap sticking up. That's causing us to lose lift on our wing, but because our flaps are just after the center of gravity. Now, ideally, if your flaps are right at the center of gravity, you know, it's just going to give you pure lift and some drag. It's not going to give you too much of a pitching moment, but that tends to be unrealistic. They don't really get it right on there, and especially if you're moving people and cargo, you're not going to get that either. Let's watch how the plane behaves. Very flat. Notice the tail doesn't come down at all. I manually bring the tail down. We had less lift on that. I could feel it, but notice it wasn't picking my tail up. All right, so that's one way we can tell that, yes, my center of lift with my flaps is aft of my center of gravity. It's trying to pick my tail up. We had no problem with that flap setting. All right, so just a little food for thought on how the aerodynamics of flaps work, what they do, how they move your center of gravity around. And with that knowledge, you can play with your designs and get an aircraft to either, you know, perform better or not. Now, you can also do some quote-unquote cheats in-game. All right, so let's do this. Let's hook my flap. I'll load up the plane. Where are we at here? All right, so one thing you could do is some cheats. So let's say my center of lift, right? We know our center of lift is a little bit aft of our center of gravity. One thing we could do if we wanted to, you know, quote unquote cheat it a little bit in game is, let's try a test here. Let's take a couple fins. Now I actually do see this in real life somewhat. Let me see if I can find it. Here's a Sukhoi Su-35 Sea Flanker. So let's look at the Sea Flanker. So if we look at the flanker, the Sea Flanker, you notice that you see these two canards right here on the front. All right, let me see if I can find the SU. Trying to find the regular one, not the Navy version. Let's see. All right, here it is. So here's the other flanker. Notice no canards, right? Can I get a Sea Flanker next to it? So yeah, so if you notice the two planes here, this one is the non-Navy version. This one is the Navy version. No canards, canards. So why does this one have canards and this one doesn't? Well, it's for the Navy. So what's the Navy often do? Well, they make more robust landing gear because it has to land very hard in the carrier. So they put more, they put heavier metal, they put reinforcement in there, so they're adding a lot of mass. They also put a tail hook on there, bunch of extra mass, big piece of metal. So you're taking a bunch of metal, right, and you're moving it towards the aft. And so they put these control surfaces up front to essentially work with that new center of gravity. So, you know, if you see, oh, adding little fins is unrealistic, well, they do it in real life. They would have had to completely move the wing on the flanker if they didn't do that. So we know our center of gravity is probably a block. It's probably right within line without flaps. So what we could do is we could add a little bit of lift in the front. Now this is a game thing if you wanted to do it. You can add some fins like so. All right, and let's go. I need to tie these into electricity here to make it work. So one thing you could do is, let's say you're struggling to get that nose up. Remember, when I have normal flaps, I'm getting a little bit of tail pitch first, which, again, isn't a big deal. You just need to understand what your build is doing and accommodate it. But we're going to plug these 2 fins in. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a constant number. And let's just make these, oh, I don't know. Let's make that like a 0.3. All right. And we want to make sure those go up. So let's go look at them. And so as you can see, these are tipped up. We can even check it in the editor as well. Note the camera's doing its funky business again. Notice the solid arrow line is there. That means that it's going to tip this way and cause us to get an increase in pitch. So with this number here, this should give us a lift now of, what did I put in there, 0.3. So that's going to add lift to the front. Now you can hide those, you cannot hide those. Again, this is one of the ways in game that you can make something that looks realistic, and you know, things might not weigh correctly what they weigh in game in real life, so you might have to either throw weight blocks in, or you could add some little fins there to move the center of lift. So what I'm doing here is moving my center of lift forward. All right, so if we look at our fin, let's page up here. Let's see if I can get close enough to do it. It's not letting me see it, but yeah, it's not letting me see it, but that's there. As you notice, they're plugged in. You can even see it tipping up a little bit, about 30% up. All right, let's try it now. So we should expect that my nose, so let's go back down to our first setting of flaps here. So let's actually go, let's go 23 degrees of flaps, that half flap that I was showing you. Remember when we did the half flap test that it was really picking my tail up? Okay, so let's try this. And so this should help it almost lift off more flat, right? The tail will still try to pick up because of the flaps being after the center of gravity, but so those fins in the front are now trying to pick the front up. So this is another way to kind of play with your aerodynamics. You know, it's like the Skags on like an F-18. Help give it a little extra lift in the nose. There are a lot of things like that as they do different modifications to get them to work. So let's watch how it behaves. Notice the tail's trying to still come up a little bit. That's because of the aft center of gravity. And it lifts. Now let's go full flaps and see what those fins do for us. Remember, when I went full flaps, I needed about 10 degrees nose down, right, to maintain my altitude. Let's see where it is now. Right there. So right about there. So we're at about, what was it, 11 or 12 degrees nose down. With these fins now further forward, that's causing a little bit to drag the center of lift a little bit forward. So these are all things you can do in game to try to get better flight characteristics. But again, at the end of the day, if you set your plane up correctly and you have the center of lift pretty much in line with your center of gravity, you're going to save yourself a lot of problems. By getting your different factors in line, your center of thrust should be in line with your center of gravity, your center of lift should be in line with your center of gravity. By doing all these very basic factors, what it does is it makes your aircraft very easy to fly. It makes it very easy for you to work on and very predictable. You'll notice a lot of weird airplanes out there with little fins here and there and all over the place. You know, I think the F-4 Phantom had some strange fins and strakes on it. Those are all them throwing on extra surfaces to try to correct issues with the design. Those tend to be design issues. Some of them are, are unavoidable. You add a bunch of missiles to something, you add a bunch of bombs, you decide you're going to put a second seat in the cockpit, and now you've moved the center of gravity and you need to throw some sort of control surface in there to add lift somewhere. And so you do see that a lot in real life. But I hope you guys found this interesting. I know some people have some issues with control surfaces, center of gravity, center of lift, and I like talking about this stuff. This was my passion, so I figured make a little video for you guys. So hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.